My son told me to leave my grandson's baptism right in front of God and everyone. So I smiled, walked out, and made one phone call that destroyed their perfect little family. 3 days later, Vanessa was in handcuffs, and David was begging me to come back. But by then, it was far too late. Drop your city in the comments and subscribe. Ready for an amazing story? Let's begin. Let me tell you how a grandmother's broken heart turned into the sweetest revenge you'll ever hear. 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect family. My son David had married Vanessa, a beautiful young woman who seemed to adore him. When little Jacob was born, I was over the moon. Finally, a grandchild to spoil and love. But perfection, I've learned, is usually just a well-constructed lie. It started small, like these things always do. Vanessa would make little comments about my cooking being too heavy for David. She'd suggest I call before coming over because they might be busy. She'd post family photos on social media, but somehow I was never in them. When I mentioned it to David, he'd just shrug and say, "You know how young mothers are, Mom. Give her time." So I gave her time. 6 months of walking on eggshells, bringing store-bought cookies instead of homemade ones, calling 3 times before visiting, and pretending not to notice how my daughter-in-law's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. The breaking point came when Jacob's baptism was planned. I offered to help with the reception, maybe make my famous apple pie that David had loved since childhood. Vanessa's response was swift and cutting. "Oh, that's so sweet, but we're keeping things simple. Professional catering only." Professional catering. For a baptism reception in the church fellowship hall. I should have seen it coming then. Should have realized that a woman who'd replace her mother-in-law's apple pie with store-bought desserts was capable of much worse. But love makes you stupid sometimes, especially when it comes to family. The night before the baptism, I ironed my best navy dress, the one Robert had always said brought out my eyes. I polished my grandmother's pearls and practiced holding Jacob just right for the photos. I'd bought him a beautiful silver baby cup from Tiffany's, engraved with his initials and the date. I even wrote a speech in case they asked family members to share a memory or blessing. What a fool I was. The morning of the baptism dawned bright and clear. I arrived at First Methodist 15 minutes early, carrying Jacob's gift and wearing my proudest grandmother smile. The church was decorated simply but elegantly with white roses and baby's breath. Friends and family were already gathering in the pews, everyone dressed in their Sunday best. I found David near the altar, looking handsome in his charcoal suit and holding my grandson like he'd been born for fatherhood. My heart swelled with such fierce pride and love that I almost forgot about the tension of the past months. "David, sweetheart," I called softly, approaching with the gift box. That's when I saw Vanessa's face. She was standing near the baptismal font in a flowing cream dress, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine. But when she saw me coming toward them, her expression shifted from serene to furious in a heartbeat. She whispered something sharp in David's ear, her manicured fingers gripping his arm with white-knuckled intensity. I watched my son's face change, saw him glance between his wife and me with the look of a man caught between 2 fires. "Mom," he said quietly when I reached them, not meeting my eyes, "we need to talk." The gift box suddenly felt heavy in my hands. Around us, the church filled with soft conversation and gentle laughter as more family arrived. I could see my sister Martha settling into a pew near the front, saving me a seat. Everything looked normal, festive, perfect, except for the storm clouds gathering in my son's eyes. "What's wrong?" "Honey?" I asked, though something cold was already spreading through my chest. David looked at Vanessa again, and she gave him a small, sharp nod, the kind of nod that said, "Do it now or else." "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, we think, maybe it would be better if you didn't stay for the ceremony." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around us, the church continued its gentle buzz of preparation. Someone was testing the microphone. The organist was warming up with a soft hymn. Life was continuing normally while my world tilted sideways. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me understood perfectly. "It's just," David struggled, glancing at his wife for support. "You've been difficult lately. The comments about the catering, showing up uninvited last week, the way you keep criticizing Vanessa's choices. Difficult." The word echoed in my head like a bell tolling. 6 months of biting my tongue, walking on eggshells, and swallowing my pride. And I was difficult. "David," I said carefully, "I bought him a christening gift. I'm his grandmother." "I know, but Vanessa feels uncomfortable, and this is supposed to be a peaceful, spiritual moment for our family. Our family. Not his family that included me, but their family that clearly didn't." The church fell silent around us, as if everyone had suddenly sensed the drama unfolding. I could feel eyes turning our way, hear the whispered conversation starting. My sister Martha was looking concerned, half rising from her pew. That's when Vanessa stepped forward, her voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. "Margaret, I hope you understand. This is Jacob's special day, and we just want everything to be perfect and peaceful. Maybe it's best if you take some time. Take some time." Like I was having a breakdown instead of being publicly humiliated by my own family. The gift box slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. The sound seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet church. I looked at my son, waiting for him to speak up, to defend me, to remember that I was his mother and had earned better than this. Instead, he just stood there, holding my grandson and avoiding my eyes. That's when something inside me died, and something else was born. I bent to pick up the fallen gift box, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. When I straightened, I looked directly at my son and said the words that would haunt him for weeks to come. "Of course, dear. I understand perfectly." The relief on Vanessa's face was so obvious it was almost comical. She actually smiled, thinking she'd won. David looked surprised by my calm response, maybe even a little disappointed. Had he wanted a scene? Some drama to justify their cruelty? Sorry to disappoint, but I'd been raised better than that. "I'll just say goodbye to Jacob," I said, reaching for my grandson. For a moment, Vanessa hesitated, probably wondering if this was some trick, but the church was watching, and she couldn't very well refuse to let a grandmother kiss her grandchild goodbye without looking like a complete monster. She nodded stiffly. I took Jacob in my arms, feeling his warm weight against my chest. He was so beautiful, so perfect, with his father's dark hair and those incredible blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. He gurgled softly and grabbed at my pearls with tiny, curious fingers. "Goodbye, my sweet boy," I whispered against his soft head. "Grandma loves you more than words can say." I handed him back to David, picked up the gift box, and walked out of First Methodist Church with my head held high and my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. But here's what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known as they watched me leave. I'd been expecting this moment for weeks. You see, being dismissed and underestimated has its advantages. People stop noticing what you're doing when they've decided you don't matter. They forget that you have eyes and ears and a brain that's been watching and listening and putting pieces together for months. I'd known Vanessa was trouble from the day David brought her home 3 years ago. She was 28 then, beautiful in that calculated way that comes from expensive salons and personal trainers. She laughed at all of David's jokes, praised his cooking, and seemed genuinely smitten. I wanted to like her. I really did. But there were little things. The way she'd answer David's phone when I called, claiming he was in the shower or busy with work. How she'd redirect conversations when I asked about her family or her past. The expensive clothes and jewelry that seemed far beyond what a dental hygienist should be able to afford, even with David's good salary as an accountant. I'm not stupid, and I'm certainly not naive. I've been around long enough to recognize when something doesn't add up, so I started paying attention. It began innocently enough. I'd noticed things during my visits. Credit card statements left on the kitchen counter showing charges to places David claimed they'd never been. Phone calls Vanessa would take in another room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. A wedding ring tan line on her finger that was slightly wider than the band she wore as David's wife. Then there was the day I decided to surprise them with lunch and found a man leaving their house at 11 in the morning. Tall, well-dressed, driving a Mercedes with California plates. When I asked David about it later, he looked genuinely confused. What man? Vanessa didn't mention anyone stopping by. That's when I decided to do something Robert would have laughed at me for. I hired a private investigator. James Morrison was a retired police detective who specialized in background checks and domestic situations. Recommended by my neighbor's daughter, who'd used him during her own messy divorce. Professional, discreet, and thorough. I feel silly, I'd told him during our first meeting at a coffee shop downtown. Like I'm some paranoid old woman who watches too much television. James had smiled kindly. Mrs. Thompson, in my 30 years of police work, I learned that a grandmother's intuition is usually more accurate than a lie detector test. What specifically concerns you? So I told him everything. The inconsistencies, the expensive lifestyle, the mysterious visitor, the way Vanessa seemed to have no past before David. James listened without judgment, taking notes in a small, neat handwriting. I'll need about 2 weeks, he'd said. Maybe less if she's as careless as she sounds. She was careless. Incredibly, arrogantly careless. Within 10 days, James had uncovered what I'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true. Vanessa Maria Santos was already married, had been for 4 years, to a man named Carlos Santos in San Diego. Not only was my son living with a bigamist, but his wife was also systematically stealing from him. The bank records James obtained showed regular transfers from David's accounts to a bank in California. $1,500 every month for the past 2 years. When confronted about the money, Vanessa had apparently told David it was for her ailing mother's medical expenses. Her mother, who was, according to James's research, perfectly healthy and living comfortably in a paid-off house in San Diego, courtesy of her daughter's marriage scam. But the real kicker? The piece of information that made my blood run cold? Vanessa wasn't just a bigamist and a thief. She was also a kidnapper. Baby Jacob wasn't David's son. According to the birth certificate James had obtained from California records, Jacob Santos was born 6 months ago to Vanessa Santos and her legal husband Carlos. The birth certificate David had signed was a forgery, and the baby he'd been caring for as his own son was technically a missing person. Carlos Santos had been looking for his wife and child for 3 months, ever since Vanessa disappeared with the baby and $30,000 from their joint bank account. As I walked out of that church, that gift box under my arm and my dignity intact, I had James Morrison's complete report in my purse, along with Carlos Santos's phone number. David wanted me gone? Fine, but he was about to learn that some phone calls change everything. I got in my car, drove to the parking lot of the grocery store 2 blocks away, and pulled out my cell phone. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Funny how clarity can calm even the most broken heart. The phone rang 3 times before a man answered. Hello? Mr. Santos? This is Margaret Thompson. I believe I know where your wife and son are. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Carlos Santos spoke, his voice rough with emotion and barely controlled hope. Jacob? You know where Jacob is? Yes, I said, watching churchgoers file out of First Methodist in the distance. The baptism ceremony was probably starting right about now. And I know where your wife is too. Oh, God, he breathed. Oh, thank God. Is my son okay? The pain in his voice made my chest tight. This man had been living the same nightmare I was just beginning to understand, having his child stolen by someone he'd trusted. He's safe, I assured him. He's healthy and well cared for. But Mr. Santos, there are some things you need to know. I told him everything. About David, about the false marriage, about how his wife had been living as Vanessa Thompson for almost 3 years, how she'd convinced my son that Jacob was his child, how she'd been stealing money from David's accounts, supposedly for medical expenses. $1,500 a month for 2 years, Carlos said, his voice growing hard. She cleaned out our savings account and maxed out our credit cards before she left. I've been wondering how she was surviving. Your son has been baptized today, I continued, at First Methodist Church in Millbrook. They're probably having the ceremony right now. There will be a reception afterward at the church fellowship hall. I'm in San Diego. I can catch the next flight. But, Mr. Santos, I interrupted gently, before you do anything, you need to call the police. What your wife has done, it's not just bigamy and theft, it's kidnapping. You need to have everything documented properly. Another pause. Who are you? Why are you helping me? I looked toward the church where my family was celebrating without me. I'm Jacob's grandmother, or I thought I was. Your wife has destroyed my family, stolen from my son, and broken more hearts than just yours. But mostly, I'm calling because that little boy deserves to be with his real father. Thank you, Carlos whispered. I don't know how to thank you. Just get your son back. After ending the call, I sat in my car for a long time, watching people come and go from the grocery store. Normal people doing normal things on a Sunday afternoon. Shopping for dinner, buying flowers, living their ordinary, unbroken lives. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Martha. Where did you go? Everyone's asking. I turned off my phone without responding. Let them wonder. The drive home took me past the church one more time. I could see cars still filling the parking lot. People dressed in their Sunday clothes, mingling outside in the spring sunshine. Through the stained glass windows, I caught a glimpse of white robes and heard the faint sound of organ music. Jacob's baptism was happening right now. My grandson, except he wasn't really my grandson, was being dedicated to God while his real father sat in California, frantically booking a flight to claim his stolen child. By tomorrow, everything would be different. By tomorrow, David would understand exactly what it felt like to have your family ripped away by someone you trusted. But first, I had one more phone call to make. At home, I sat in Robert's old chair and dialed the Millbrook Police Department. I need to report a kidnapping, I told the dispatcher. 2 hours later, Detective Linda Hayes sat in my living room, a small digital recorder on the coffee table between us. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of my daughter's soccer coach from years ago. Mrs. Thompson, she said, I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You're telling me that your son's wife has been living under a false identity for 3 years, that she's married to another man in California, and that the child your son believes is his biological son was actually kidnapped from her legal husband? That's correct. And you learned this information through a private investigator you hired? Yes. I handed her James Morrison's complete report. Morrison's. Everything is documented there. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, bank records, photographs. Detective Hayes flipped through the report, her expression growing more serious with each page. This is substantial. If true, we're looking at multiple felonies. Bigamy, identity theft, grand theft, kidnapping. It's true. The child is currently at First Methodist Church. I checked my watch. The baptism ceremony should be over by now. They're probably at the reception. Mrs. Thompson, I have to ask, why didn't you come forward with this information earlier? If you suspected something was wrong months ago, it was a fair question. Because until today, I hoped I was wrong. I hoped there was some explanation that wouldn't destroy my son's life. And because I paused, feeling the weight of my own honesty. Because I was a coward. I didn't want to be the one to break his heart. But something changed today. She had me thrown out of my grandson's baptism, made my son choose between his wife and his mother, and he chose her. So I stopped protecting the people who were hurting both me and that innocent baby. Detective Hayes nodded. We'll need to coordinate with the San Diego Police Department and the FBI since this crosses state lines. The father is flying in tonight? He should be. This is going to be complicated. Mrs. Thompson, your son is going to feel like his entire life has been a lie. His entire life has been a lie. She stood up, tucking the report into her briefcase. We'll start with questioning Vanessa Santos. Can you think of any reason she might run if she suspects we're onto her? I thought about Vanessa's smug smile as she watched me leave the church. No, she thinks she's won. She thinks she's convinced everyone that I'm just a bitter, jealous mother-in-law causing trouble. She has no idea anyone knows the truth. Good. That gives us an advantage. After Detective Hayes left, I called James Morrison to thank him for his thorough work. Then I poured myself a glass of Robert's good wine, the bottle we'd been saving for a special occasion, and sat on my back porch watching the sun set behind the oak trees. Tomorrow would bring chaos, pain, and probably more heartbreak than any family should have to endure. David would hate me, at least at first. He'd feel betrayed, humiliated, and devastated. The woman he'd loved and trusted had used him in the cruelest possible way. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Peace. My phone stayed off until the next morning. When I finally turned it on, there were 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, most from David, increasingly frantic as the hours passed. Mom, where are you? People are asking about you. Seriously, call me back. Mom, this isn't funny. Something's wrong. Please call. I'm coming over. The last text was from 3 hours ago. I looked out the front window and saw David's car in my driveway. David was sitting on my front porch steps, still wearing his suit from yesterday but looking like he'd slept in it. His hair was messy, his tie was gone, and he had the shell-shocked expression of a man whose world had just imploded. "Mom," he said when he saw me at the door, his voice hoarse. "Thank God. Where have you been? Why didn't you answer your phone?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw exhaustion, confusion, and something else I hadn't seen in months. Remorse. "I turned my phone off," I said simply. "Would you like some coffee?" He followed me into the kitchen, moving like a man walking through a minefield. Everything about his body language told me that Detective Hayes had paid them a visit last night. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." I poured coffee into 2 mugs, added cream to mine, and sat across from him at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd helped him with homework 20 years ago, where I'd listened to him practice for school presentations, where I'd celebrated his graduation and promotions, and what I'd thought was his engagement to a wonderful woman. "Ask away. Did you call the police on Vanessa?" "I reported a crime, yes." David's hands shook as he picked up his coffee mug. "They arrested her last night, right in front of everyone at the church reception. Federal agents, Mom, FBI, they handcuffed my wife in front of my friends, my coworkers, everyone. She's not your wife, David. Don't." His voice cracked. "Just don't. Not yet." I waited while he struggled with words, watching this strong man I'd raised fall apart piece by piece. "They showed me documents," he finally said. "Marriage certificate from San Diego, birth certificate with different names, bank records showing money being transferred to California. They say she's been stealing from me for 2 years. She has been. And Jacob?" His voice broke completely. "They say Jacob isn't mine. They say his real father is flying in from California to take him home." I reached across the table and took his hand, surprised when he didn't pull away. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. How long have you known?" "I've suspected for months. I hired a private investigator 2 weeks ago. I got proof last Thursday." David stared at me, processing this timeline. "You knew when you came to the baptism yesterday? You knew she wasn't really my wife, and Jacob wasn't really my son, and you still came?" "I came because I love you, because I wanted to see my grandson one more time before—" I stopped, not wanting to hurt him more than necessary. "Before what?" "Before you learned the truth and lost him forever." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything that had been destroyed in 24 hours. Finally, David spoke again. "She made me ask you to leave. I didn't want to, but she said if I didn't support her, she'd take Jacob and move back to California. She said you were trying to undermine our marriage, that you were jealous of our happiness. And you believed her. I loved her. Mom, I thought she loved me. I thought Jacob was my son." He looked up at me with eyes full of pain and shame. "When you walked out of that church, do you know what I felt? Relief. Relief that the drama was over, that Vanessa would be happy, that we could have a peaceful family celebration." The honesty in his confession hit me harder than yesterday's humiliation had. "And now? Now I feel like the biggest fool who ever lived. Now I understand why you were asking questions about her past, why you seemed concerned about her expensive clothes and jewelry. You weren't being nosy or jealous. You were trying to protect me." I squeezed his hand. "I was trying to protect all of us. The man flying in from California, Jacob's real father. What's he like?" I thought about my brief conversation with Carlos Santos, about the desperation and love in his voice. He's heartbroken. He's been looking for his son for 3 months. According to the investigator, he filed missing person reports, hired his own private detective, spent his life savings trying to find them. Does he know about me? That I thought Jacob was mine? He knows. And David, he's grateful that you've been taking care of his son. He doesn't blame you. You're as much a victim in this as he is." David buried his face in his hands. "I have to give him back. Don't I? I have to give Jacob to a complete stranger and pretend the last 6 months didn't happen. He's not a stranger, honey. He's Jacob's father." The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. Through the front window, I could see a police car in the driveway and Detective Hayes walking up the front steps with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, dark-haired, and carried himself with the nervous energy of someone running on pure adrenaline and desperation. Even from a distance, I could see Jacob's eyes in his face. "That's him," David said flatly. "That's Jacob's real father." I opened the door to find Detective Hayes with Carlos Santos, who looked like he'd been traveling all night and running on nothing but hope. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Hayes said, "this is Carlos Santos. He's here to reclaim his son." Carlos stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Thompson, I can't thank you enough. You saved my boy." "Where is Jacob now?" I asked. "Protective custody," Detective Hayes said. "We took him into care last night while we sorted out the legal issues. Mr. Santos has provided DNA evidence proving paternity, along with the original birth certificate and medical records." Carlos's hands were shaking. "Can I see him? It's been 3 months since she took him. I need to see him." "Of course." Detective Hayes looked at David. "Mr. Thompson, would you like to accompany us? We understand this is difficult for you, too." David stood up slowly, looking every one of his 34 years and then some. "Will you come with me, Mom?" I looked at this broken man who was my son, who'd chosen his wife over his mother just 24 hours ago, who was about to lose the child he'd thought was his own flesh and blood. Despite everything, despite the humiliation and the months of being dismissed, he was still my baby. "Of course I will." An hour later, we stood in a Child Protective Services office watching Carlos Santos hold his son for the first time in 3 months. Jacob recognized his father immediately, reaching for him with a delighted gurgle that brought tears to everyone's eyes except David's. David just stood there like a statue, watching the man who'd been his son for 6 months bond with his real father. I wanted to comfort him, but some pain is too deep for comfort, too vast for words. "He's grown so much," Carlos whispered, kissing Jacob's head. "Thank you," he said to David. "Thank you for taking care of him. I know this isn't your fault." David nodded stiffly. "He's a good baby. He sleeps through the night now. He likes those little puffs with the sweet potato flavor. He's starting to sit up on his own." "Would you—" Carlos hesitated. "Would you mind telling me more about what he's been like? I've missed so much." And there, in that sterile government office, my son spent an hour telling a stranger about the daily life of a baby he'd loved as his own. First smiles, favorite toys, bedtime routines, the way Jacob liked to grab at shadows on the wall. Carlos listened to every word, occasionally asking gentle questions, clearly treasuring each detail about his son's stolen months. By the end of the conversation, both men were crying. When we finally left CPS, Carlos Santos had his son back, and David had nothing but an empty car seat and a lifetime of wondering what was real. "Mom," David said as we stood in the parking lot, "I owe you an apology. For yesterday, for the last 6 months, for not trusting your instincts about Vanessa. You don't owe me anything except honesty going forward." "I do owe you something," he insisted. "I owe you respect. I owe you gratitude. I owe you recognition that you were protecting me even when I was too blind to see it." He hugged me then, really hugged me, for the first time since Vanessa had come into our lives. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we heal. Now we rebuild. Now we remember what family really means." But as we drove home separately, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. 3 weeks later, I was frosting a birthday cake in my kitchen when the phone rang. David's name appeared on the caller ID, which had become a welcome sight again since Vanessa's arrest. "Hey, sweetheart," I answered. "How are you holding up? Actually, that's why I'm calling." His voice sounded stronger than it had in weeks, more like the confident man I'd raised. "I wanted to thank you again, and I wanted to tell you something important." I set down my spatula and gave him my full attention. "What is it?" "I've been going to therapy. Dr. Rebecca Martinez. She specializes in relationship trauma and family recovery. And Mom, she helped me understand something I need you to know." "What's that?" "You didn't just save me from Vanessa. You showed me what real love looks like." I felt my throat tighten. "David." "No, let me finish. When Vanessa demanded I choose between you and her, I chose wrong. I chose the person who was manipulating me over the person who had loved me unconditionally my entire life. And when you found out the truth about her, you could have embarrassed me privately, let me figure it out on my own, or just walked away from our whole mess. I stirred the frosting thoughtfully, remembering those dark moments when I'd considered doing exactly that. Instead, you made the hard choice. The choice that would hurt in the short term, but protect everyone in the long term. You called Carlos Santos knowing it would destroy what I thought was my family, but you did it because Jacob deserved his real father, and I deserved the truth. I did it because I love you both. That's what Dr. Martinez said. She said that what you did was an act of profound love, even though it looked like betrayal from my perspective. She called it tough love with consequences. I smiled at that. Sounds like a smart therapist. She is. And she's helped me realize something else. I want to make things right between us. Really right. Not just apologize and move on, but rebuild our relationship on honest ground. I'd like that. Good, because I have a proposal. Are you free Saturday afternoon? I think I can manage that. What did you have in mind? Carlos Santos called me yesterday. He wants to meet with both of us. He's driving up from San Diego with Jacob, and he asked if we'd like to spend some time together. Get to know each other properly. I nearly dropped the phone. He wants to see us again? Mom, he considers you Jacob's grandmother. Not biologically, but emotionally. You were there for Jacob's first 6 months of life. You bought him gifts, held him, loved him. Carlos doesn't want that connection to disappear just because the truth came out. Tears started flowing before I could stop them. I'd been trying so hard not to think about Jacob, not to miss those tiny hands grabbing at my pearls, or the way he'd settle in my arms like he belonged there. And me? I managed to ask. He wants Jacob to know me? He wants Jacob to grow up knowing all the people who loved him, including the woman who saved him from a kidnapper and the man who cared for him when his father couldn't. Saturday afternoon arrived bright and warm. I'd changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress and my grandmother's pearl necklace. David picked me up at 2 o'clock, looking nervous but hopeful. You okay, Mom? I think so. It's just surreal. Meeting my grandson's real father as my grandson's real father, you know? I know exactly what you mean. We drove to Riverside Park, where Carlos had suggested we meet. It was neutral ground, he'd said, somewhere comfortable for everyone. As we pulled into the parking lot, I saw them immediately. Carlos Santos was pushing a stroller along the walking path, pointing out ducks to Jacob, and keeping up a steady stream of cheerful conversation in both English and Spanish. Even from a distance, you could see the bond between father and son, the way Jacob's head turned toward his father's voice, the protective way Carlos hovered near the stroller. There they are, David said unnecessarily. He looks like a good father. He does. We approached slowly, giving Carlos time to notice us and prepare. When he looked up and smiled, I felt some of my nervousness fade away. This was the same man who'd thanked me through tears in that CPS office, who'd listened so gratefully as David shared months of memories about his son. Margaret, David, Carlos waved us over. Thank you for coming. Jacob had grown in the 3 weeks since I'd last seen him. His hair was a little longer, his cheeks a little fuller, and he was sitting up confidently in his stroller. When he saw David, he made a happy babbling sound and reached out with both arms. He remembers you, Carlos said softly, lifting Jacob out of the stroller and carrying him toward us. David's face crumpled with emotion as Jacob patted his cheeks and grabbed at his hair with delighted squeals. Hey, buddy, David whispered. Look how big you're getting. Then Carlos turned to me, and I found myself looking down into those blue eyes I'd fallen in love with 6 months ago. Hi, Jacob, I said gently. Do you remember Grandma Margaret? He stared at me for a moment, then smiled and reached for my pearl necklace, just like he'd done at the baptism. My heart broke and healed at the same time. We spent 2 hours in the park. Carlos told us about Jacob's life in San Diego, his own family, his job as a civil engineer. He showed us pictures of Jacob's room, his cousins, the daycare where he'd be going when Carlos returned to work. In return, we told Carlos more stories about Jacob's time with us. The night he'd first slept through until morning, the way he'd giggle during diaper changes, how he'd learned to grab his own toes and put everything in his mouth. I want him to know these stories when he's older, Carlos said. I want him to understand that even though his first months were complicated, he was surrounded by people who loved him. As the afternoon wore on, something beautiful happened. We stopped being awkward strangers thrown together by tragedy and became something else, an unusual but genuine extended family. "Carlos," I said as we prepared to leave, "would you mind if I stayed in touch? Maybe sent birthday cards, Christmas presents?" "Margaret, I was hoping you'd ask. Jacob doesn't have grandparents on my side anymore. They passed away before he was born, but he has a grandmother who loved him enough to save him, and I'd like him to know that as he grows up." David cleared his throat. "And Carlos, if you ever need anything, babysitting when you're in town, someone to talk to who understands what it's like to love that little guy, please call." "I will." "And David? Vanessa stole from both of us. She stole your time with someone who would have been a son to you, and she stole my time with my actual son. But she didn't steal the love. That's still real, even if the circumstances weren't." Driving home, David and I were quiet for a long time, processing the emotional complexity of the afternoon. "Mom," he finally said, "I know this is weird, but I feel better now. Not healed, but better." "Me too. Carlos is a good man." "Yes, he is. Jacob's lucky to have him as a real father, and lucky to have had you as a stand-in father when he needed one." That evening, I called my sister Martha to tell her about our park visit. She'd been my rock through the whole ordeal, never once saying, "I told you so," even though she'd had her own suspicions about Vanessa. "So, you're going to stay in Jacob's life?" she asked. "It looks that way. And David's okay with that?" "More than okay. I think it helps him feel like his love for Jacob wasn't wasted." "What about Vanessa? When's her trial?" "Next month. Carlos says he'll testify, and so will David. The federal prosecutor thinks she'll plead guilty to avoid a longer sentence." "Good. She deserves whatever she gets." I agreed, but truthfully, I'd stopped thinking about Vanessa weeks ago. My focus had shifted to rebuilding what she'd tried to destroy: trust, family, love that wasn't based on lies. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I found myself looking at the silver baby cup I'd bought for Jacob's baptism, the one with his initials and the date engraved on the side. I'd never given it to him, had forgotten about it in all the chaos. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd wrap it up and send it to Carlos with a note explaining its significance. Jacob might not understand now, but someday he'd be old enough to hear the story of his complicated beginning and the grandmother who loved him enough to tell the truth. I placed the cup on my nightstand where I could see it when I woke up, a reminder that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is the hardest thing you can imagine. Outside my window, the moon was bright and full, casting shadows across the garden Robert and I had planted together 20 years ago. Everything looked peaceful, normal, exactly as it should be. But I knew now that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving, that love sometimes required courage more than comfort, and that family wasn't just about blood or marriage certificates or baptism ceremonies. Family was about showing up, telling the truth, and protecting the people you love, even when they can't see that they need protecting, especially then. Margaret's Story, Chapters 10. 2 months after that day in the park, I thought the worst was behind us. Vanessa was in federal custody awaiting trial, David was rebuilding his life with therapy, and Carlos had become part of our extended family. I should have known that stories like ours don't end that simply. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Martinez, David's therapist, had never called me directly before. "Mrs. Thompson, David gave me permission to contact you. Something has come to light that you should know about. Can you come to my office this afternoon? You might want to bring someone for support." "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Martinez began, "in working with David, we've discovered something disturbing. Vanessa Santos isn't just a bigamist and kidnapper. She's what we call a professional predator. David wasn't her first victim." She opened a thick file. "We've identified 4 other men across 3 states who were targeted by women matching Vanessa's methods. In each case, different names, different backgrounds, but the pattern was identical." "What pattern?" I asked. "She targets recently divorced or widowed men with good incomes, creates false identities, studies them for weeks, then establishes accidental meetings." My stomach turned cold. David wasn't randomly targeted. No, Vanessa had been watching David for months before they met at that coffee shop. She knew about his divorce, his job, his finances, even his relationship with you. "Doctor." Martinez's expression grew grave. 2 victims lost money but survived. 1 died under suspicious circumstances, and 1 named Thomas Mitchell from Phoenix. His mother Eleanor became suspicious and was found dead 3 days later. Apparent heart attack. The room spun around me. She kills people who threaten her schemes. It appears so. Mrs. Thompson, you may have saved not just Jacob, but also David's life, and quite possibly your own. I thought about all those months when Vanessa had seemed to resent my presence, my questions, my very existence in David's life. How many times had she looked at me and wondered if I was becoming a problem that needed to be solved? There's more, Dr. Martinez continued. The FBI believes Vanessa is part of a larger organization. This level of identity creation, background fabrication, and victim research requires resources and expertise beyond what one person could manage alone. You're saying there are others like her? We believe so. The FBI has been tracking what they're calling romance fraud networks for years. Professional criminals who target vulnerable people, steal their assets, and disappear. But Vanessa's methods were more sophisticated than typical romance fraudsters. Martha spoke up for the first time. What does this mean for David? For the trial? It means David was victimized by someone far more dangerous and calculating than we initially realized. It also means the federal charges against Vanessa are likely to be much more serious than we first thought. That evening, I sat with David in my living room, sharing what Dr. Martinez had told us. He listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just absorbing the magnitude of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. 4 other men, he finally said, and one of them might be dead because his mother got suspicious. David, you can't blame yourself for not seeing through such an elaborate deception. She was a professional criminal with years of experience. But Mom, don't you understand? She was planning to kill you. If you hadn't discovered the truth about Jacob, if you hadn't made those phone calls, his voice broke. I could have lost everything that actually mattered while protecting someone who was planning to murder my mother. We sat in silence for a while, both processing the terrifying alternate reality we'd narrowly escaped. Finally, David spoke again. There's something I haven't told you, something I was too ashamed to admit even to Dr. Martinez until this week. I waited, sensing this was important. Remember how Vanessa always had explanations for her expensive clothes and jewelry? How she said her previous job had been very well paid? Yes. And remember how she always seemed to know exactly what to say to make me feel better about any concerns you or Martha raised? I remember. David's hands were shaking as he continued. Last month I found something in the garage while I was packing up her things for the police. A notebook hidden in a box behind some old Christmas decorations. He pulled out a small, leather-bound journal and set it on the coffee table between us. She kept notes, Mom. Detailed notes about me, about you, about our family dynamics. She documented my schedule, my financial habits, my emotional triggers. She recorded our arguments, our conversations, even our intimate moments. I stared at the journal like it was a poisonous snake. She was studying you. Like a scientist studies a lab rat. Look at this. He opened to a page marked with a bookmark. This entry is from 2 months after we started dating. David responds well to subtle criticism of his mother's interference. Suggesting Margaret doesn't trust his judgment creates immediate defensive loyalty. Use sparingly to avoid detection. The clinical coldness of it made me nauseous. And this one from last Christmas. Margaret suspicious of jewelry gifts. Need to establish stronger wedge between D and mother. Consider pregnancy announcement to create permanent family obligation. She was planning to fake a pregnancy? She was planning everything, Mom. Every fight between us, every moment of doubt you felt about her. Every time I chose her over you. It was all calculated manipulation based on her psychological profile of our family. I thought about all those times I'd felt like I was being unreasonable, oversensitive, too protective. All those moments when I'd questioned my own instincts because they seemed to conflict with David's happiness. David, she was a professional. You couldn't have known. But you did know. Your instincts told you something was wrong from the very beginning. And instead of trusting the woman who raised me, who loved me unconditionally my entire life, I trusted someone who was literally taking notes on how to manipulate me more effectively. That's when the last piece of the puzzle fell into place for me. David, she didn't just target you randomly. She targeted our family specifically because of me. What do you mean? Think about it. A widow with a close relationship to her adult son, significant assets from Robert's life insurance, and a tendency to be protective of family. I was the real threat to her long-term plans because I was the one person who might see through her act. So removing you from the picture wasn't just about accessing my money. It was about removing the one person who could expose her. Exactly. And when throwing me out of the baptism didn't work, when I didn't retreat and disappear like she expected, I paused, understanding flooding through me. She would have had to escalate to more permanent solutions. The journal sat between us like evidence of a nightmare we'd barely escaped. As I looked at my son, I realized that in trying to save Jacob, I had unknowingly saved us all. 3 weeks before Vanessa's trial, FBI agent Patricia Moreau visited me. She was about David's age with sharp eyes and calm authority. Mrs. Thompson, I'm investigating what we call Operation False Promise, the romance fraud network Vanessa was part of. For 2 hours, Agent Moreau questioned me about every interaction with Vanessa, the casual financial questions, her interest in my health and routines, how she'd gathered information about our family. She was profiling you, Agent Moreau confirmed, building a psychological portrait to neutralize you as a threat. She showed me photographs on her tablet. We've identified 6 victims across 4 states. This man, Robert Chen from Seattle, lost $40,000. Marcus Williams from Denver lost $200,000. And the man who died? Thomas Mitchell from Phoenix. His mother Eleanor hired a private investigator like you did. 3 days before the report, Eleanor suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. I studied Eleanor's photograph. She looked like me. Silver hair, intelligent eyes, a mother who loved her son enough to ask uncomfortable questions. How did she die? Officially, heart attack. But Eleanor was found with tea that tested positive for chemicals that can trigger cardiac episodes in elderly people. My blood ran cold. She was poisoned. We exhumed her body last month, found enough evidence to convince us Eleanor Mitchell was murdered. Agent Moreau showed me an organizational chart with dozens of photographs. The family operates like a business. They have researchers who identify targets, infiltrators like Vanessa, support staff who create false identities, and cleanup specialists. Cleanup specialists? People who eliminate threats. People like Eleanor Mitchell. I stared at the chart, processing the criminal empire we'd exposed. How many victims? 37 confirmed cases over 5 years, but we believe that's a fraction of their activity. And now? Now we have a living witness who uncovered their operation before completion. Your testimony gives us our best chance of bringing down the entire network. That evening, David and I sat in my kitchen processing what Agent Moreau had told us. The magnitude of the criminal organization we'd exposed was staggering, and the realization that I'd been marked for elimination was still sinking in. "Mom," David said quietly, "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about since we found Vanessa's journal." "What is it?" "Remember the night you had that fall in your bathroom? About 2 months before the baptism?" I did remember. I'd slipped on what I thought was a wet spot on the tile floor and bruised my ribs badly enough to consider going to the emergency room. Vanessa insisted on coming over to check on you. She brought soup and stayed for 2 hours, cleaning your bathroom and making sure you were comfortable. I remember. I thought it was very thoughtful. David's expression was grim. I think she was testing something, seeing how you'd react to a staged accident, how your recovery would go, whether anyone would be suspicious if something happened to you. The soup, the thorough cleaning of my bathroom, the way she'd asked detailed questions about my symptoms and recovery time. She was rehearsing, I said, the truth hitting me like ice water. That fall wasn't an accident. I think she created the wet spot, waited to see if you'd fall, then positioned herself as the concerned daughter-in-law who came to help. If you'd been seriously injured, she could have escalated from there. And if I died from the fall, she would have been the grieving family member who'd tried so hard to take care of you. No one would have questioned your death, and she would have eliminated the biggest threat to her long-term plans. We sat in stunned silence, realizing how close I'd come to being another Eleanor Mitchell, another suspicious mother whose concerns were silenced permanently. "David," I said finally, "tomorrow I'm calling Agent Moreau back. They need to investigate that bathroom incident." "Mom, what if there are other things we haven't thought of? Other times she might have been testing ways to hurt you." I thought about all those family dinners, all those times Vanessa had insisted on helping in the kitchen, all those occasions when she'd been unusually solicitous about my health and well-being. Then we're going to remember them all, every single one. And we're going to help the FBI put these people away for the rest of their lives. As I locked my doors that night and set the alarm system David had insisted on installing, I realized that discovering Vanessa's true identity had been only the beginning. We hadn't just uncovered a marriage scam. We'd stumbled into the middle of a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of lives. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something stronger than fear or anger. I felt purpose. Eleanor Mitchell had died asking the right questions, but asking them too late. Thomas Mitchell had lost his mother because she'd gotten too close to the truth. Not this time. This time, we were going to be the ones who brought them down. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a cold Tuesday in November. When Vanessa was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, she looked smaller without her designer clothes. But when our eyes met, I saw cold calculation, as if she was still working angles. David sat beside me, jaw clenched tight. When the prosecutor asked for her plea to charges of kidnapping, bigamy, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse, Vanessa's voice was flat and professional. Not guilty to all charges. Her defense attorney had been hired by serious money, evidence of how organized this network was. Then the bombshell dropped. The government calls Mrs. Elena Rodriguez to the stand. A woman in her 70s walked slowly to the witness stand, using a walker. She looked hollow-eyed, traumatized. Mrs. Rodriguez, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. She was my daughter-in-law, married to my son Miguel for 6 years. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. When did you last see your son Miguel? 14 months ago, before the accident. Can you describe this accident? Mrs. Rodriguez began crying. Miguel fell down the stairs carrying laundry. The stairs were slippery. Vanessa was there, called the ambulance, seemed so worried. What happened to Miguel? He died from head trauma. The doctor said the fall was very unlucky. David reached for my hand. This wasn't just fraud. This was murder. After Miguel's death, what happened to his estate? Vanessa inherited everything. Almost $300,000. 2 weeks after the funeral, she took the money and disappeared. During recess, Agent Moreau found us. We found Vanessa's journal about Miguel, too. Notes about his schedule, insurance policies, physical routines. She studied him like she studied David. With one difference. In Miguel's case, she completed the plan. When court resumed, forensic pathologist Dr. Harold Brennan testified that Miguel's injuries suggested he was struck before falling, that his death was staged murder. As we left the courthouse, David spoke quietly. The night before the baptism, Vanessa suggested a larger life insurance policy on me. $500,000. She had the paperwork ready. If I hadn't made those phone calls, I would have signed that policy and probably had an unlucky accident within months. That night, I realized we still didn't know the full scope of what we'd uncovered. Other families were being targeted. Other elderly parents who asked questions were being marked for elimination. I'd made a decision that would change my life. I wasn't just going to testify against Vanessa. I was going to help the FBI bring down the entire network. Some fights are worth the risk, even when the enemy is more dangerous than you imagined. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday in December, 3 days before Vanessa's trial. Nothing good ever happens at that hour. Mrs. Thompson? Agent Moreau's voice was urgent. Stay calm. We're sending security to your house. Vanessa Santos escaped federal custody 6 hours ago. I was fully awake now. How? The transport van was ambushed by 3 individuals with military weapons. 2 marshals are critical. This was professional extraction. The family has decided you're too dangerous to leave alive. 20 minutes later, I was in an armored SUV watching my house disappear in darkness. Agent Moreau sat beside me, coordinating the manhunt. Safe house in Virginia, completely secure until we recapture Santos. What about David, Carlos, and Jacob? All in protective custody. As we drove, Agent Moreau explained the escape. Someone with inside access provided transport details to the family. We're investigating federal employees, court personnel, anyone with that information. The safe house was a nondescript ranch surrounded by woods and watched by federal agents. Agent Moreau explained the situation. Vanessa isn't just an escaped prisoner. She's a professional assassin whose entire network is threatened by your testimony. How long will this take? We have every resource looking. But Margaret, I need to be honest. We found something in her cell, a detailed floor plan of your house, security codes, and your daily routines. She was planning to come after me even before escape. More than that, we found correspondence with someone called the Architect. This person has been directing Vanessa's operations, and they've decided your existence poses unacceptable risk. So this isn't revenge, it's protecting their network. Exactly. And the messages suggest eliminating you is just first step. They're planning to systematically remove everyone connected. David, Carlos, other victims. Agent Moreau, what if I testify remotely? Defense would challenge it. Without in-person testimony, we might not get convictions on serious charges. And if I don't testify? Vanessa walks free. The family continues. More families destroyed, more people killed. I thought about Eleanor Mitchell, Miguel Rodriguez, all the victims whose lives were destroyed by professional predators. There's something else, something that changes everything. She opened her laptop. Vanessa Santos isn't just a family member. Based on financial records, we believe she's one of the founding leaders. What does that mean? She's not following orders. She's giving them, and she has access to resources we never suspected. The records showed a criminal empire far more sophisticated than imagined. The family operates like a corporation. Departments for recruitment, research, execution, cleanup, money laundering, legal protection. Vanessa ran the Romance Infiltration Division, overseeing dozens of operatives. How many victims? Conservative estimate, over 200 confirmed cases in 5 years. Real number could be much higher. That night, I called David at his safe house. Mom, are you okay? I'm fine, but I need to tell you something. I'm going to testify, in person, no matter the risks. Mom, no. These people kill to protect themselves. They're going to kill anyway. Other families, other innocents. The only way this ends is if we stop them completely. But what if something happens? Then at least I'll die, knowing I fought back. The next morning, I told Agent Moreau my decision. Margaret, are you certain? Once decided, there's no going back. I'm certain. But Agent Moreau, I want something in return. What's that? I want to know who the architect is. I want to look in the face of the person who ordered my death. She smiled grimly. If everything goes according to plan, you'll have that chance sooner than you think. The courtroom was under lockdown tighter than most prisons. Federal agents lined the walls, snipers on rooftops, everyone screened 3 times. Despite the security, I felt strangely calm walking to the witness stand. Vanessa sat at defendant's table in bulletproof vest, shackled. She'd been recaptured 2 days earlier at a private airfield, but it was the person in the gallery that made my heart race. An elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, expensive suit, distinguished bearing, except for cold calculation in his expression when he looked at me. Agent Moreau had whispered, "The architect, Dr. Harrison Blackwood, retired psychology professor. He's been running the family for 8 years." For 3 hours, I told our story. The baptism, humiliation, phone calls that changed everything. The discovery of Jacob's identity, Vanessa's arrest, the revelation we'd stumbled into something sinister. During cross-examination, defense attorney Reed made his fatal mistake. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it true you hired a private investigator because you were jealous of their happiness?" "No." Reed smiled smugly and pulled out medical records. "These show prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication in your name for 2 years. I looked at the documents. Heart racing. These prescriptions were never filled by me. Are you saying these are falsified?" "No. I'm saying someone used my identity to obtain these medications without my knowledge." The courtroom buzzed. Reed had walked into a trap. Someone who had access to my personal information. Someone who studied my routine and had opportunities to steal my identity, I said, looking at Vanessa. Because if I had died suspiciously, those records would suggest I was mentally unstable, possibly suicidal. Perfect cover for my murder. The revelation hit like an explosion. Vanessa hadn't just planned to kill me. She'd spent months creating false medical history to prevent investigation. Agent Moreau took the stand and presented evidence from Dr. Blackwood's arrest. We found an operations manual, including profiles of targets, financial records, and what he called the Final Solution Protocol. Can you explain this protocol? Dr. Blackwood's plan to eliminate all witnesses threatening the family. Mrs. Thompson was target number 1 on 17 people marked for assassination. The scope was staggering. The protocol included detailed assassination plans designed to look accidental. But most disturbing was his long-term plan, expanding globally, franchising methods to organizations worldwide. During recess, Dr. Blackwood approached me in the hallway. "Mrs. Thompson, you've been a most formidable adversary." "You ordered my death," I replied calmly. "You're not my adversary, just another criminal who thought he was smarter than he was." His mask slipped, revealing rage underneath. "You have no idea what you've destroyed." The family represented order, efficiency. What you call justice, I call murder. What you call order was organized cruelty. This isn't over, Mrs. Thompson. There are others. You've won this battle, but the war continues. Then they'll have to get through me and every person brave enough to fight back. I'm not afraid of you anymore. 3 weeks later, guilty verdicts on all counts. Life sentences without parole for both Vanessa and Dr. Blackwood. 6 months after that, I sat in Carlos's San Diego backyard, watching Jacob take first steps toward his father's arms. David was there, along with 3 other families whose lives the family had destroyed but were now rebuilding. "Margaret," Carlos said, lifting giggling Jacob, "I still don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. Just live a good life and make sure he knows that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the right thing." That evening, David and I walked the beach. "Mom, Dr. Martinez says you probably saved hundreds of lives by testifying. Maybe thousands if Blackwood's expansion plans had succeeded. I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because it was right. That's what makes you a hero." We walked in comfortable silence, watching sunset over the Pacific. "Mom, what you said to Dr. Blackwood about not being afraid anymore, did you mean it?" "For most of my life, I was afraid of making waves, causing trouble, being difficult. Afraid if I spoke up, people would stop loving me. And now? Now I know the people worth loving will love you more for standing up to evil. And the people who stopped loving you for doing right weren't really family to begin with." As we turned back toward Jacob's laughter ringing across the yard, I realized my story had come full circle. Started with humiliation that felt like the world's end, ended with victory that literally saved lives. But the most important thing wasn't criminals caught or crimes prevented. The most important thing was rediscovering something I'd lost. The knowledge that a grandmother's love, backed by fierce determination and uncompromising courage, could move mountains and topple empires. Sometimes making one phone call at exactly the right moment changes everything. The woman told to leave her grandson's baptism had found her voice, strength, and true family. And she'd learned that being underestimated by your enemies is the greatest advantage of all.